How's everyone doing? All right. Today we're going to get into how we use StatCrunch to plot a categorical variable. And I'm going to start off using our movie database data set here that we've already imported into StatCrunch. And I want to go ahead and make some plots of this variable, whether or not the movie is a sequel or part of a franchise. Whenever we want to make a plot in StatCrunch, it's really easy. We go to Graph. Notice that when you go to any sort of plotting command here, it gives you two options. First, you can plot with a raw data set, which is what we're using right here. But StatCrunch is really nice in that it also lets you plot a summarized data set. So in other words, very often when you're working with a categorical variable and say you're reading an article, they don't give you the raw data set, they give you the summarized data set. So for example, if we look at the movie database, this would be the summarized data set where someone's already counted the number in each category. And so if you had that information, say you're reading a paper and you want to do the analysis and you have this summarized data set, you can go ahead and still do the analysis. And we're going to see how to do that in Excel and StatCrunch. It's a really nice feature. Okay, so I'm going to go to Graph, and this bar plot option is going to let us make 3 of the 4 plots we want to make. We're going to make a bar plot, a relative frequency bar plot, and then a Pareto plot. So I'm going to click on With Data, and I'm going to select the variable that I want. You can plot more than one categorical variable. You go ahead and just click on one variable, hold the control button down, click on the other, but we only want to plot one here. I'm going to choose frequency for type. Okay. And it's always important, one of the nice things I like about this is you can put the value above the bar. And that's very useful because very often it's difficult for a person to tell the exact value by trying to take the bar and extrapolate over to the y-axis, especially if a category is very far away from the y-axis. It's kind of tough to draw that line in your eye. And it's very important whenever you make a plot to put on axis labels in a title. The criteria for a good plot is that a person should be able to look at the plot and understand what they're looking at without going back and reading the article or needing any other information. So the plot should be kind of standalone and self-explanatory. So if you're making a bar plot, the horizontal axis is not a number line, it's just representing placeholders for different categories. So I'm going to put here whether a movie was a sequel or part of a franchise. Okay. For the y-axis, I'm plotting counts, so I can use counts or frequency or number. Either one is the same. I'm just going to use frequency here. Frequency is kind of the adult word for counts or numbers. And the title, you generally have to think about it a little bit, but it's better to be very informative and make the title a little bit long, okay? Sometimes people might pose the title as a question. So are movies, are there a lot of movies that are sequels or parts of franchises or remakes or whatever? I'm going to take a more formal approach and be a little more long-winded. So I'm going to use the word distribution. Okay, distribution just means what values the variable can take on and how frequent or how common each of those values are. And admittedly, this is a little long, but you can go back and kind of edit it, maybe make it a little bit shorter. But now you can look at this plot and you can tell exactly what you're looking at. Okay, you're looking at movies from 2015, you know the source, and this plot is telling us whether or not movies are sequels or parts of franchises, and it's actually giving us the distribution of the movies that fall into one of those two categories. And putting the counts above is really nice. Now, if I want to make a relative frequency bar plot, all I have to do is go to Options, Edit, and where it says Frequency, click on % for type. This is the type of plot you're making, okay? And then, of course, I have to go back and change the label on the y-axis now to percentage. Sometimes people are really kind of, really careful and they say percentage of total. Sometimes people will say relative frequency. I think percentage suffices, and you plot it, and now you can see that the y-axis has changed. Now it's a percentage, and you have the correct label here for the y-axis. The third plot, which is very interesting, is what we call a Pareto plot, and I want to show this to you. So what a Pareto plot does is it takes a data set when you have a lot of different categories and it organizes them in descending frequency. And very often this is used in business. So you might have, for example, a lot of people who are buying a certain product or a lot of different vendors, and you want to find out the one that is most frequent, right? You want to find out who are your biggest buyers and this sort of thing. And so Pareto came across this actually when he was analyzing data. He was an Italian economist, and he created this thing called the Pareto principle. And the Pareto principle says that 80% of the effects are caused by 20% of the population. So for example, in business, very often you'll hear the saying that 80% of the sales come from 20% of your customers. Anytime you're dealing with metrics involving human performance, you'll see this sort of law apply. In the criminal justice system, for example, 80% of the crimes are committed by 20% of the criminals. Very often in the workplace, if you're in human resources, 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. If you're in economics, 80% of the wealth is held by 20% of the people. So this is a really famous law. And Pareto actually discovered this law. It's a fascinating story. But how he applied it was he was looking at land holding in Italy. He was an Italian economist back in the 1920s and 30s. And what he noticed was that the majority of the land was held by a small percentage of the people. Unfortunately, Mussolini, who was coming into power at that time, used that fact as an excuse or as a pretext for instituting fascism. He said, oh, this is unfair to people. And the reality is it's just a general consequence of capitalism. Okay, there's nothing unfair about it. But I want to show you how this actually works in StatCrunch and why it's useful. So here I have data on Olympic Games results. These are the countries, okay, the different countries that competed, total number of games they competed in, the number of gold medals they won, silver, bronze, and total. And you notice this is a summarized data set now, okay? I'm looking at counts. I'm not looking at raw data. And I want to make a Pareto plot. I want to show you why you'd want to do that. So I'm going to go to Graph, and under Bar Plot, I'm going to say now with Summary. Now my categories are countries. And the counts, I'm going to go ahead and plot the number of gold medals. And I'm not going to worry about the titles and everything right now. I just want to show you how this works. So when you go ahead and plot this, you can see this graph, it's really kind of hard to make sense of it, right? And what I'd really like to know, usually, is which countries won the most. And this is what a Pareto plot does. It sorts the categories in descending counts. So I'm going to go back here now, under Options, and hit Edit. And where it says Order By, I'm going to say Counts Descending. And I'll put the value above the bar. And now you can see this is much, much easier to interpret and understand, right? And I'd have to blow this up a little bit. There's a lot of categories, right? But now you can easily kind of compare things. And if I wanted to, I could probably make this in terms of percentages, and it would make a little more sense, right? So instead of frequency, I would do %. And you can see that of all the gold medals won, the US has won roughly a third of them. the Soviet Union 14%, Germany, and so on. Okay, so this is a very useful sort of plot. But we use it when we have a lot of categories and we want to see which categories are most frequent. Okay, so the last plot we have to make is a pie plot. And I'm going to get rid of this for a second. So I'm going to go to graph, pie plot, pie chart here. Why does this not want to work for me? There we go. I'm going to use the data. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and just plot the sequels or franchises. Notice that you can display just the count or just the percentage of totals. The default is it does both. And there is no x-axis or y-axis, but you can put a title in here. And again, I can say, you know, distribution of 2015 movies. Okay, and there we go. And I don't need to click anything else. And you can play around with the color scheme. I'm not going to bother to do that, okay? It's not a bad idea to kind of play around. And there you can see, there's our plot. Now, people often ask, what should I make, a bar plot or a pie plot? I think pie plots are good when you want to emphasize very sort of general aspects of the data. So if I just wanted to give someone the idea that there are a lot more movies that are not sequels or part of franchises, this would be good. If you want people to have a more quantitative idea of what the data is like, usually bar plot's better. It's kind of like tomato, right? Which is easier for your eye to compare, the heights of bars or the areas of pies? My vote would be for the heights of bars, okay? Plus, you can put the number right above the bar, and it's just kind of more visually organized. There is one time when pie plots are actually really bad, and that is either you have categories that have really small percentages, or there is a second case, which is when you have a lot of categories. And let me show you with this example from the gold medals. I'm just going to leave this here. But under a pie plot, I'm going to go ahead and choose with summary. And the way we enter the commands is the same. And I'm going to say compute. And you can see this is really busy. So if I compared these two plots, I would definitely take this plot over the pie plot. I can't organize the pie plot. To me, this is much more confusing. The backgrounds become hard to see because you have so many colors. Eventually, the color of the text is not going to stand out against the background color for one of these slices, and so on and so on. And there's just a lot of information here for a person to take in. So when you have a lot of categories, or categories have really small percentages, in other words, the slice of the pie is really, really small, it's generally not going to be a particularly good choice. Okay, we'll talk more about plotting two categorical variables a little later on, but this is it for one categorical variable.